영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Dracula, Part 1, Jonathan Harker's Diary 1. Journal entry, March 17th, 1875, Transylvania. My name is Jonathan Harker, and I work as a realtor for a London office, negotiating deals for foreign clients who wish to purchase an English residence or business. My position requires me to scout out a suitable property to match each client's interests and prepare the legal paperwork for the transaction. One day, my employer received correspondence from Count Dracula in the country of Transylvania, located beside Russia on the coast of the Black Sea. He was interested in immigrating to England and wanted us to find him a home that would satisfy a particular set of conditions. It took me almost 3 weeks to secure a property that he found acceptable, but after he reviewed the property, I managed to settle on a good price. Then, much to my chagrin, he requested that I deliver the paperwork to him personally at his castle in Transylvania. I discussed the situation with my fiancée, Mina, and she encouraged me to make the trip. We were planning to be married in the autumn, and the trip would possibly postpone our plans, but I knew that the Count's business was important. I did not know then that I would be placing myself and my beautiful Mina in terrible danger. It was a long and difficult journey to Transylvania, first by boat from England, and then on land by coach. Finally, after several days of travel, we reached a small town called Bistritz, nestled at the foot of a high mountain ridge. The driver informed me that his horses needed to be fed and rested, so I stepped out of the coach and found a quaint little inn where I could eat supper. The atmosphere was warm and friendly, and before too long, I was approached by the kind innkeeper who offered me a glass of ale and a mutton steak. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "I am taking some legal papers to Castle Dracula," I replied. A sudden hush came over the room. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned to look at me. "Here," said the innkeeper, taking a gold cross from his neck and handing it to me. "You shouldn't go there. But if you must, take this. It can't completely protect you, but at least it's something." I hesitantly put it on, and as I turned to leave, I thought I heard someone say vampire. The winding road up to Castle Dracula was rugged, yet we were driving at a modest pace. The air had turned frigid once the sun set behind the mountains, and for the first time, I realized just how high we'd climbed. I felt chilled from the inside out, as though someone had sucked all the heat from my body. I buttoned up my coat and sank down into my seat, hoping to stay warm, but it was no use. I stared up at the dark, foreboding sky and thought of Mina. Finally, just after 3 o'clock, we arrived at the castle. I quickly climbed out of the coach and had barely enough time to retrieve my suitcase before the driver cracked his whip and his horses sped off into the darkness. "Good evening, sir," a voice spoke from behind me. Startled, I turned around and saw that there was a queer-looking man standing in the doorway. He had white hair, was unnaturally tall, and wore a suit that was completely black. "I am Count Dracula. Please follow me." I picked up my suitcase and followed the Count through the castle's massive wooden doors, which he locked behind us, and up a flight of stairs. We came to a large, open living room, and I was pleased to find food and wine set out for me on a small table in front of a warm fireplace. "Your room is down the hall," he explained. After I had put my suitcase away and freshened up, we sat down together at the table by the fire. The Count did not eat. He patiently watched me finish my meal, and then talked briefly about the history of the castle. As he was speaking, I couldn't help noticing that his hands were covered in fine hair, like animal fur, and that his fingers were long and bony. The next morning I awoke with a start, quickly washed, and changed into my suit. Then I went downstairs to find my host and discovered that there was no one to be found in the castle, not even a servant. There was only a note that read, "Mr. Harker, please feel free to explore the castle. But if you come to a locked room, please do not attempt to enter it. Enjoy your breakfast. We shall discuss more tonight." I wandered back up the stairs and noticed that a simple breakfast of bread, ham, and water had been set out for me by the fire. After eating, I returned to my room rather unsatisfied and applied myself to preparing the final paperwork. I hoped that we would be able to finalize the purchase that night and I could begin the long journey home the next day. I was sorely mistaken. I was preparing for bed that evening when the Count knocked on my door and called me into the living room. We sat by the fire, and he asked me a series of seemingly bizarre questions about the home I had selected for him. I explained to him that it was a large, secluded property, fenced in by a tall stone wall and surrounded by plenty of old trees. It even has its own parish chapel, I told him. Ah, does it have a cemetery too? So I would be close to the dead, he asked. I was thrown by his question. Why would he care about such things? What could he possibly want with a cemetery? We continued talking for a long time, and I became so tired that I began to drift off. All of a sudden, I jerked awake and found the Count's face close to mine. I could smell his foul breath, like the smell of death, and almost gagged in disgust. I apologized and retired to my room. The next evening I was relieved to discover that the Count had signed the paperwork, but my happiness was quickly quashed. He asked me if I would be able to stay on in Transylvania for another month to assist him with some logistical concerns about transporting his material goods to England. I was disappointed. However, I reluctantly agreed because I felt I had no choice. For the next fortnight, we met regularly, always after sunset, to discuss English culture, politics, and what he should expect in his new environment. In addition, I helped him arrange cargo shipping by boat, although he admitted that he had few material goods to transport. All the talk of the sea reminded me that Mina was scheduled to visit her best friend Lucy at her seaside home this summer. I foolishly told the Count about Mina and my wedding plans. One particularly dark evening, I was shaving by the light of a candle lamp, using a hand mirror that Mina had given me the previous year as a birthday gift. Even though I did not see the Count's reflection in the mirror, I suddenly felt his hand on my shoulder and jumped back in surprise, cutting my cheek with a razor. "Ouch!" I screamed and threw my hand over the cut. The Count rushed toward me and pulled my hand away from my face, revealing a drop of blood. I saw a strange hunger in his eyes. Then, without warning, he grabbed the mirror and threw it on the floor. It broke into 1,000 pieces, and without a word, he turned around and abruptly left the room. I heard him lock the door behind him. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't until I sat down on the bed to think about what had just happened that it dawned on me. I was a prisoner here. I was being held captive in Castle Dracula, and there was no way out. Dracula, Part 2, Jonathan Harker's Diary 2. Journal entry, October 10th, 1875. I don't know how many days I spent waiting in my room before the next time I saw the Count, but some time later he came to my room with another disheartening request. He wanted me to write to my London office and inform them that I would be staying on in Transylvania for yet another month. My blood went cold, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt coerced, but did as he asked. The next evening, I dressed for supper and went out into the living room to meet the Count, as I'd done previously, but when I arrived, he was not sitting by the fire as he usually did. I was rather relieved until I saw that there was a small note sitting on the table along with my food and wine. It read, "Heed my warning. Do not fall asleep in any room of this castle except your own, because if you do, you will be placing yourself in horrible danger." I shivered with fear. I suffered from terrible nightmares that night. Eventually I awoke, put on my robe, and left my room. Scared to return to my dreams, I wandered the halls of the castle, looking for something to occupy my mind and keep me from sleep. Most of the castle doors seemed to be locked, but eventually I stumbled upon a room that was open and cautiously snuck in. The decor was suited for a woman's taste, A frilly canopy bed sat in the center, and beyond it, a large window, accented with heavy velvet curtains, overlooked the mountain ridge that sat between the castle and the small town of Bistritz. I walked over to the window, attracted by the yellow moonlight that filtered into the room, and stared up at the stars, thinking of Mina. Suddenly, something from outside the window grabbed my hand. It was the Count. I jumped away from the window and shook him off, my eyes wide with shock. He had scaled the outer walls of the castle, then climbed in through the window and began to crawl toward the door on all fours. With his black cloak wrapped around his body, he looked like a large black dog. I expected him to attack me, but thankfully he just made his way out of the room, as though he didn't see me there. Relieved, I collapsed onto the bed, shaking with fright. What was he? I lay there for several minutes, overcome with exhaustion. I felt my eyelids droop shut, and soon I was warm and cozy, dreaming of my beautiful Mina. The sound of women's whispers gradually woke me from my slumber, and when my eyes finally fluttered open, I realized that there were 3 gorgeous young women standing at the foot of the bed. I thought I heard one of them say, "Oh, how handsome and strong he looks." "Yes," said another, "he is strong enough to give us all kisses." All 3 leaned down toward my face, and because I was so confused that I didn't realize what I was doing, I lifted my lips to receive them. I saw their ruby red lips and alabaster skin, and I longed for their kisses too. "Kiss me," I whispered as one of them brushed my lips with hers. "Ah!" she gasped. Something had grabbed her and pulled her off of me. It was the Count. When she saw that she would not get her way, I saw her blue eyes flash a red color like the fires of hell. "Off!" he demanded. "He is not for you." Everything went black as I fainted. When I opened my eyes again, I was in bed in my own room, and it was daylight. I sat straight up in horror and said aloud, "Vampires! They were trying to drink my blood." Of course, it all makes sense now. The Count must be one as well. Vampires cast no reflections and avoid sunlight. What should I do? 2 days later, the Count called me out to the table by the fireplace, where he had laid out a paper and ink set. "You must write to Mina," he said, "and tell her that your business at Castle Dracula is finished, and that you will be returning home shortly." At first, I was thrilled to hear that I would finally be leaving this insane place, away from the madness of the Count. But he continued, "Tell her that you were in Bistritz, and date the letter June 29th. My heart sank, and I knew for certain that the Count was planning to murder me on that day. When Mina received the letter, she would think that I was lost at sea. Fearing for my safety, I composed the letter and returned to my room to think. A few minutes later, there was a commotion outside the door, and my ears caught the sounds of women giggling. I heard the Count say, "Wait, my pretties. He will be yours soon enough." Then he locked my door from the outside, trapping me within my room. I was frantic. What could I do? I had to try to escape to Bistritz, but how? The next few days seemed like an eternity as I waited for an opportunity to escape, but none presented itself. Then, one evening, I was sitting in my room looking out at the moonlight over the mountains when, from the courtyard, I heard the voices of workmen. "Maybe one of them will help me," I said aloud to myself. However, when I rushed to the window and peered down, I saw the Count hand one of the men a letter, my letter. I quickly found my calendar and checked the date. Sure enough, it was the 29th already. I was doomed. I had to do something fast. I paced back and forth in my room trying to think of a solution. It was then that I looked up at my window and had a brilliant idea. I would take down the curtains and weave them into a thick rope that I could use to climb down to the room beneath mine. With luck, the door to that room would be unlocked and I could escape from there. I knew that I could work freely during the daylight hours, so I waited until sunrise and then went to work. I tied the rope into a tight knot around my bedpost and began to lower myself out of the window. I almost fell twice, but finally my feet found the lower ledge, and I hurriedly climbed into the room beneath my own. It was empty save for a small pile of gold in one corner and a wooden trapdoor near the other corner. This was curious, I thought. What if this were a secret passage out of the castle? I turned the knob, gingerly opened the door, and came upon a short stone staircase. I slowly descended, careful not to make a sound. I came to another large room, but this one was not empty. There in the darkness was a collection of boxes. No, they were coffins lined up in rows, all filled with fresh soil. And at the end of one row, I discovered the Count lying motionless in a velvet-lined casket, arms crossed over his chest. He looked younger, his hair was black, and his hands appeared more human-like. There was fresh blood on his lips. Just then I heard the workmen approaching and began to panic. Were they vampires too? No, they couldn't be. It was daytime now, so they would be exposed to sunlight. But maybe they were cursed by the Count and under his spell. I couldn't be certain if they would help me or kill me if they found me in this room, so I quickly hid behind one of the coffins and watched as two of them closed the Count's casket and continued to unlatch a double door at the far end of the room. What luck! There was another way out of the room, and I could make my escape. Then the other four reached down and heaved one of the soil-filled coffins up onto their shoulders and carried it out through the double door. When all their backs were turned, I silently slipped out behind them and realized I was in an open field behind the castle. I was free. I had nothing with me except the clothes on my back and this journal to keep me company. But I preferred to take my chances in the wilderness than face my fate back inside the castle. It would be days before I found help.
Dracula, Part 3, Mina's Story. September 4th, 1876, London. Dear Diary, when Jonathan told me that he had been asked to travel to Transylvania on business, I was devastated because I knew that it meant we might have to postpone our autumn wedding plans. Regardless, I encouraged him to go, hoping that he could use this opportunity to secure more business from Count Dracula in the future. Still, I was worried that I would be lonely without him. To pass the time, I went to visit my best friend Lucy at her seaside home in Whitby, a summer resort town north of London. Her boyfriend Arthur had just asked her to marry him, so we had a lot to discuss and plan for her nuptials as well as my own. Jonathan wrote me a letter from Transylvania, but it's very strangely worded, I complained to Lucy one day. Maybe he's ill, she replied, but in the next breath, she continued gushing over her beloved Arthur, describing how he'd proposed to her on the shore at dusk. She always talked about him, and I felt myself becoming jealous. Why had Jonathan left me for so long? And why were his letters so short and strange? I was angry with him, yet worried for him as well. The sea air smelled so fresh and wonderful that it revived my senses after so many long, dreary English winter days spent in London. Lucy and I took walks together each afternoon before tea time, along the beach where the calm waves from the North Sea washed up on shore. The sky seemed perpetually blue, with no rain for many weeks, until one night, a terrible thunderstorm came in off the coast. The next morning, a giddy Lucy banged on my patio doors, waking me up early, and told me to put on my robe. "Come out here on the shore," she called. Look at the ship." When I arrived at her side on the beach a few minutes later, I could barely believe my own eyes. There on the shore, just a few feet from her property, was a large ship that must have crashed in the night. The townspeople were gathered around it, and Lucy asked a young man if there was anyone on board. "Nobody," said the young man. "There wasn't anyone on board, dead or alive." But there were about 50 wooden coffins filled with soil on the lower deck, and when we went to open the door, a large black dog jumped out. He ran off into the woods. Everyone in town was talking about the mysterious ship that afternoon. "It's a Russian ship," I overheard one man tell his friend. "Yup, it looks like it's come across the Black Sea from Varna. There are logs, but nobody has filled them out for weeks." A realtor from London came to collect the cargo this afternoon, but even they don't know what happened to the captain and crew. It's as if they had vanished into thin air. Has anyone seen the black dog? I asked. They just shook their heads. Sometime after midnight that night, I awoke to find my bedroom patio doors open and a cool breeze blowing into the room. I got up to close them, but when I looked out, I saw Lucy skipping across the lawn toward the woods. Lucy had once told me a story of how she loved to play in the woods as a child, close to the cemetery out by the old abandoned parish down the road. I was overcome with worry. Maybe she was walking in her sleep and didn't know what she was doing. I promptly pulled on my robe and hurried out into the yard to follow her. When I finally caught up to Lucy, she was indeed at the parish in the cemetery, but her mannerisms were childlike and strange. She was sitting on top of a gravestone, humming a song to herself. Her eyes were closed and she was swinging her feet like a child. Behind her, a figure moved in the shadows. The dog. Then, all of a sudden, the black dog leaped out of the woods and attacked Lucy's neck. She let out a shrieking scream that scared it off. Then she tumbled from the gravestone, landing hard on the ground and lost consciousness. I called for Arthur's help immediately, and he came rushing to Lucy's side, knelt down and picked her up in his strong arms. Together, we carried her into her room and put her in bed. She had lost all the color in her face, but had only 2 small puncture wounds on her neck, which were dripping with blood. Lucy's mother telephoned their family doctor, Jack Seward, and we waited anxiously for his arrival the next morning. Unfortunately, by the time his coach pulled up, Lucy's condition had worsened. She was awake, but appeared to be in a trance, just staring out the window toward the woods and humming a little tune to herself. The strange illness persisted. The doctor and I took turns staying with Lucy through each night, watching for any changes. One evening, I fell asleep in the chair next to her bed, and in the middle of the night, I was awoken by a noise. Lucy was standing next to the window and talking out loud to herself. "Come to me," she said. "I will give you what you want." I stood up and walked over to her, but before I could stop her, she opened the window and tried to jump out. I pulled her back to the bed, and as I did, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the large black dog pacing back and forth in the woods. I shuddered with fear. Finally, after many stressful days, I received a letter from Jonathan telling me that he was in Bistritz and would be taking the next boat home to England. However, my excitement was dashed because after a fortnight he had still not arrived in London. Then one chilly morning, I received notice from a hospital in Budapest that my fiancé was in their care after arriving on foot with nothing but the clothes on his back. Poor Jonathan was quite ill, just as Lucy had suspected. I told Arthur about the situation, and he insisted that he would nurse Lucy so that I could go take care of Jonathan. At the Budapest hospital, a sympathetic nurse led me down a long corridor and into Jonathan's room. "He's quite dehydrated, and his clothes are ragged," she explained. "We think that he walked here on foot from Transylvania, but he won't acknowledge any of our questions. He only asked that we send notice to you that he was here." Oh, my poor Jonathan. He was so frail and thin compared to when he had left for the castle in the spring, and I just collapsed in his arms crying. "Why won't you tell us what happened?" I begged. But instead of responding, he just handed me his diary and motioned for me to sit in the chair next to his bed. In the pages of his diary, I was shocked to learn of his adventure in Transylvania and the horrible descriptions of the Count. The next morning, I held him tight in my arms and said, "Oh, Jonathan, I'm so happy that you are safe and far away from that man." "Yes, Mina," he replied. "As am I. I never wish to see him again." As soon as Jonathan was well enough to walk again, we returned to England by ship and were married shortly after in one of the largest churches in London. Our family and friends were delighted to see Jonathan healthy again after his great ordeal and asked him many questions about his experience in Transylvania. But no matter how many people approached him wanting a story, he never spoke of his time at Castle Dracula again. Our lives seemed to finally be settling into place when one sunny afternoon there was a knock at the door, and I opened it to discover a letter had been left on the doorstep. It was from Arthur. I ripped it open quickly, hoping that it would be news about his wedding to Lucy, but it wasn't an invitation. It was something I hadn't expected. The good Dr. Seward had tried everything to treat my dear friend Lucy, but his efforts had failed. Lucy was dead. I told Jonathan, and we made plans to attend Lucy's funeral the next week.